time too much. All right, so welcome, and I'll probably just take a break in about a minute for a couple seconds to look for Darius. Welcome everyone. I cannot believe it's already been like something like 6 weeks since I did the last one of these. I was planning on doing another one last week, but then with the uptick, I kind of decided to pick this out one more week just to see where things were headed.
Okay.
Go ahead and mute yourselves, please. And same format as before. I'll talk a bit. Hopefully it'll be useful, and then we'll definitely do a Q&A at the end. Again, you know, there's a lot of information coming out every day, so I'm not completely up on everything. So I absolutely welcome anyone and everyone to bring up questions and help to educate everyone at the end in a way that's not asking for direct medical advice from me on this particular Zoom call. Again, this will be recorded. It is being recorded. So we will send this out and hopefully the next day to probably Monday at the latest, I hope. So you can check it out if you need to or want to, or forward it to anybody. And just want to acknowledge everyone for giving up some of your time to be here. And yeah, again, hope to be a good resource for you today. So right before I get started, let me, nope, still not here. Okay, well, hopefully I'll remember to admit people as they come in. FDA disclaimer again. I am not promoting any particular prevention or treating. If I sound like I might be doing that, it's simply what I would do for myself or a close family member. And that goes for SARS-CoV-2 as well as COVID-19. You know, we're 4 months into this, maybe a little bit more than that even. So obviously this has really changed our society in major ways. I still have, you know, that fear and anxiety, that general feel of it, fear and anxiety that I've been seeing in my practice. It's still persisting, and understandably so, and it's becoming a little bit more politically charged, which is interesting and unfortunate. I think I heard someone else say that public policy is a kind of the combination of science and politics, and you know, unfortunately or fortunately, I definitely think that's true. And let me make, nope, hang on just a second. I'm gonna make someone a co-host, Darius. All right, yes, okay, should be good to go. So I just wanna reiterate, you know, I am not afraid of this virus. I'm not afraid of COVID-19, and it's because hopefully it's not me being egotistical in any way, but I just sincerely, with all my heart and soul, believe that I have a plan to make this a non-issue for myself and for, you know, most people who want to listen to a line of reasoning along the similar to mine. Again, not to be egotistical. You know, we learn so much as time goes on, but again, like I emphasized last talk, I believe that terrain is a major word that needs to be recognized and talked about more, and that's the terrain of our body. That is the health of our body. I think that's the name of the game for this. You know, people who have gotten sunlight and clean air, clean food, clean water, and have some happy thoughts, they don't get sick from this. They do not get sick. And I'll get into some statistics later on that can, you know, support that. I'd encourage people to remember, I talked about this last time, but remember your own cognitive biases. And I'm talking to myself as much as I am to everyone on this call right now. You know, once we learn something, we formulate an opinion. And then anytime we hear those words or that idea pop up, and it's kind of this side or this side, we tend to choose a side in an instant, and then we very stubbornly, unconsciously, and naively stick to that thought. And so I would ask that every one of you, and again, including myself, maybe more than anyone else, because I know a lot of you look to me for good advice, and I want to give that to you. But really, when you're looking at this question of COVID-19, really question everything and consider where you're coming at it from, and try to just recognize where you might be biased. I think that can help a lot, and I think it can help a lot with taking the politics out of this. This should not be nearly as political of a topic as it has become, at least in the US, right? I still, kind of different subject, moving on. This still looks like a blood vessel disease more than it is just a respiratory disease. It looks like there's different time courses during the course of this infection. It's like this, the SARS-CoV-2 virus infects us, and then we kind of go through this week 1 where we're asymptomatic, or maybe with some of the more common symptoms like fatigue, headache, sore throat, a mild shortness of breath. And then week 2, it seems like some people can kind of go backwards, and it becomes much of a respiratory issue. So that shortness of breath can certainly be exacerbated. Your O2 oxygen saturations might get even worse. Week 3 tends to be where people are getting blood clots, and that's a real major issue. Again, forgive me for not being able to cite every study. It's just I read so much about this now. I cannot remember where I read everything. But I heard an intelligent individual speaking about one study, and it looked like 35% of the hospitalized patients for COVID-19 were having clinically relevant blood clots. That's a huge amount. And then week 4, and maybe a little bit after that, tends to be where people, if you're recovering, you can actually get a bacterial infection superimposed. And so that would obviously require a different course of treatment. So we'll come back to that kind of week 1, 2, 3, and 4 being maybe different clinical scenarios. Separate topic. There still looks like there's no genetic drift thus far. Again, mutations are occurring, but a mutation does not mean necessarily a different pathological ability, and it does not mean a drift. The flu virus, it has a genetic drift every year, and that's why, you know, a new flu vaccine is needed, and that's why someone can get the flu literally every year, possibly. So again, this virus is not genetically drifting. And I'll mention later on that's, you know, in some ways that's good. Hopefully some of the vaccines that are going to be coming online, that will really help them, right? Because if they don't have to go back to the drawing board every year, that's obviously going to be a positive. Some quick stats. As of yesterday, there were over 7,000 deaths in California. This last week, there's definitely been an uptick in hospitalizations as well as ICU beds being occupied in California. So there is this second wave for one reason or another. It's still not that bad though, in my opinion. 77% are older than 65. Still around 50% are from nursing homes. And again, I've harped on this from the get-go, but to me, that's saying that the nearly dead people are half of who's dying from this. And that should, while it's horrible and can sound a little bit callous, it should bring comfort to anybody outside of a nursing home. And it should reinforce the need to be extremely diligent and careful with hygiene when it comes to walking into a nursing home. What else? There is definitely a trend toward younger people getting this now. They are not dying at any greater rates, though. One theory is that this first wave kind of took out the weaker people from a body physiology standpoint, and that's one theory. There's also been, I've heard it from a couple of sources now, where last year, the year of 2019, at least in the US, there was not as many deaths as would have been anticipated, or not as many as deaths as an average year would have had. And so you would actually expect that this year, 2020, there would actually be kind of an above average year for deaths. And so it would also kind of then follow naturally that COVID-19 might take out some of those, again, I hate to sound callous, but like kind of surplus people, right, who would have died normally last year. And so that's one idea that, again, I've heard from multiple sources. That does make sense. I mean, people die. The official infection rate, mortality of infections, excuse me, still looks like it's somewhere between 0.1 and 0.4%. The CDC did, well, it's been a couple weeks now, they came out with their official tally, and it's basically, they're saying in the US, it's 0.26% of the people in the US who get this virus will die. Again, that's much lower than we were originally told that it would be. And even that number, the 0.26%, is probably brought way up by the New York fiasco, the fiasco that was New York, and especially New York City in the beginning of the US pandemic. Without that, and we didn't know a lot back then about how to treat this or even really what it was. And so that definitely brought the number up. How much, I don't know, someone would have to do some number crunching that I didn't do. In LA County, it still looks like that number is probably closer to 0.12%. And LA County, there's 10 million of us in LA County. So this is a lot of people. This is a very low percentage. And again, half of those are nursing home folks. So this, it's kind of comparable to a flu, and I've talked about why not to compare it to a flu, but I think it's so important to not come at this from a fear-based state. And I think when we start talking about the numbers, it's easier to not come at this from a fear-based state. Something else that I've learned just in the last few weeks is, and it's because numbers and statistics are becoming easier to track and then actually look up. And in California, it looks like, now this number I looked up 2 weeks ago, so maybe it's changed a little bit, but it should be pretty on target though, that Hispanics were 2.9 times more likely than Caucasians to basically get dead from this virus. And that probably has less to do with genetics than it does with socioeconomic status. And so this, in the US, the lower our socioeconomic status is, we're more likely to have the diseases and medical conditions such as heart disease or chronic kidney disease or diabetes, obesity. We are basically more likely to be malnutritioned. And that's going to be another point that I really want to drive home. This is, in my opinion, I have called it a disease of malnutrition. And it goes along with the idea that this is a disease that does not need to occur the better and stronger our terrain is, right? I will remind you that even Anthony Fauci back in, again, this is in March in the New England Journal of Medicine, he himself said back then that this was going to be likely much less than 1%. So that's kind of coming from the top. There's also this was around the end of June, I think it was a Penn State University study came out that suggested the COVID-19 rate was probably somewhere around 80 times greater than originally reported. And that came from them studying New York, the state of New York. I believe it was the state of New York. It might have been a larger portion of the East Coast though. But at the time, there was around 100,000 cases of COVID, cases of positive tests at that point. And yet the influenza-like illnesses, there was a huge surge of 8.7 million new influenza-like cases. And that can't, again, they were influenza-like, not that we're influenza. So they're estimating that basically, okay, 100,000 laboratory cases of SARS-CoV-2 infection, but then an extra 8.7 million or an extra 8.6 million people with influenza-like cases. And that's where you can get the number 87 times. Now, I think it was a little bit over 100K cases. So they're saying the title of it was 80 times greater than originally reported. And those researchers, I watched them talk about it, and frankly, they were not expecting that. These were not researchers that were looking to find that kind of result. It like, in their words, utterly shocked them, and they kept running the numbers and crunching the numbers, and but they still came to this conclusion. So keep that in mind. Again, that's 80 times more potential cases than are being reported. That's huge. There's also been a lot of, not a lot, but a number of studies over these last 2, 3, 4 weeks about the T cell response. And so again, I did this in one of the last talks, but there's basically the innate immunity system. There's kind of two branches, the innate immune system over here, and then over here, number 2, there's the adaptive immunity system. And the innate immune system is really our like first line of defense. That is literally our epithelial, basically the coating of our entire gastrointestinal tract, of our respiratory tract, where we have these phagocytes and dendritic cells that basically just attack natural killer cells that just attack whatever comes. They do it indiscriminately. If they see foreign invader, they just come and attack. And they do that in the first hours to a day or so. And then the adaptive immune system starts kicking in. And so innate immune system, adaptive immune system, number 1 and number 2. And number 2, the adaptive immune system literally has 2 branches, and it's the B cells or the T cells is pretty much how it works out. And the B cells have to do with antibodies. And then there's this whole other topic about T cells. And, we've been doing antibody testing, right? So there's 2 branches of the immune system, the innate immune system, the adaptive immune system, and then there's 2 branches within the adaptive immune system, the B cells and the T cells. And the B cells have to do with antibodies. I just repeated that because it can be a little bit tougher to comprehend that. And so we've been doing, we meaning scientists, not me, but well, we do antibody tests in our office. But there's been a lot said and made about antibody testing. But it looks like T cells might have more to do with lasting immunity, or at least as much to do with lasting immunity than the B cells do when it comes to this particular virus. And there's, I don't know, there's just some really good data coming out to support that out of the US, out of other countries as well. And a case that kind of highlights it is the Diamond Princess cruise ship that was, one of the, well, I think it was the first known cruise ship to have an outbreak. And this was back in the end of January and beginning of February. And There were, I believe it was 3,700 people on board between the crew and the people who had paid to be there. 3,700 people. And I believe they were on the ship for 2 weeks total. And this is a fairly homogeneously mixed environment, right? And I mean, you're sharing a lot of the inside air, a lot of the ventilation goes in one room, goes right to the next, goes right to the next, and it just all gets recycled. I mean, unless you're out on deck, the inside air, you know, every minute you're sleeping, that air is just recycled and recycled. And so this was like the perfect enclosed study unintentionally of 3,700 people. And yet only 17% of people got infected. That is, had PCR positive tests, which does not actually mean infected. But the point is, if this were such a infective virus, more people should have been infected than just 17% of that 3,700 people. And so it suggests, it's very suggestive that there's a likelihood that prior coronavirus infections, maybe other infections as well, provide some long-term T cell immunity response to this SARS-CoV-2. And again, it's bearing out in a number of studies. I just think the Princess cruise ship is like this perfect example of how uninfective this virus actually is. And because of that, there's this idea that there's a really interesting article came out 2-3 weeks ago as well. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes, the email that goes out. But it was talking about this herd immunity threshold as being as maybe we only need to get 10 to 20% instead of a presupposed 60, 70, 80% of the population, right? Now, this is as it relates to antibodies. So typically when we think of herd immunity, we say, okay, a certain amount of the population has to be positive for antibodies. And again, for most viruses, we've always thought that it was somewhere in the 50% or up. But this one, it might be as low as 10%. Now, myself, when I'm like actually looking at real deaths and real cases in the different areas of the country, I think it's probably more like 15 to 20%. Again, that's only as it relates to antibodies, right? Because there's this whole other T cell immune response. And it could fit the New York. New York could be a very good, I don't know, kind of case study to support this potentially. Time will tell, honestly. But serology studies basically suggest that around 20%, and now this is as of, I don't know, a month and a half ago now, serology studies were suggesting that somewhere around 20% of New York, I think it was higher, like 25% in New York City itself, of people had serology, that is antibodies positivity. And what happened in New York is they got upwards of almost 1,000 deaths per day there for a little bit. And yet over the past, I don't know, month or so, I think it's even been more like 2 months, they've had almost no deaths per day. And I mean, again, there's a great website, worldometer.com, where you can look up the actual, some very good stats for different countries, as well as New York, at least. That's what I've looked at. And we're talking about like a couple of deaths per day now in New York. And they're all, I heard that a quarter of them are walking around unmasked, not social distancing really. And so you would think that if there had not been some kind of herd threshold immunity reached, that people would still be getting very sick. A lot more cases would be achieved, and there would be more deaths than that. And yet they've gone down to almost 0 deaths per day. there was a doctor, a Greek named Ioannidis from Stanford, and he suggests that 300 million people in the world, this is a world number, may have already been infected with COVID-19, or rather SARS-CoV-2. And that might be a very reasonable number. The official stat on worldometer.com//coronavirus, I think 13 million cases. So there's been 13 million cases actually PCR positive or antibody positive, right? And almost, depends what study, what country you're looking in, but all of the, like every single one of the smart people is basically, okay, what's the true, how many cases are there really, right? Not just tested, but how many are there really? And it ranges between 5 times as many, all the way up to, one estimate was 600 times as many. And in reality, it's probably somewhere in the middle. And so that Penn State University number of 80 times sounds kind of reasonable. Maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's only 50 times, but the point is a lot more people have it than don't. And if you take the official stat of 13 million worldwide cases and then multiply that, I don't know, what do you need to multiply that to get the 300 million, like by 30 approximately, maybe a little less than 30. So even the 300 million seems a little bit probably an underestimate to me currently. Now I don't remember when this came out. I don't remember how recent it is. So maybe he thinks more than that are. It could be as many as 1 billion people that have already been exposed to this, right? Now this doctor, he kind of lays it out nicely also. He also had figured out that the worldwide case infection fatality rate was actually around 0.25%, which is almost exactly what the CDC has come out with. And he lays it out very nicely because he kind of breaks it up into about 4 categories. And he says younger than 45, the infection fatality rate is almost 0, which is true. It's almost 0. For 45 to 70, it's probably about 0.05 to 0.3%. And then it's above 70 that it escalates. It can definitely escalate. And once you're 85 years old, it gets into 1% or higher each successive year. But he highlights that, in the quote, for frail, debilitated elderly people with multiple health conditions who are infected in nursing homes, it can go up to 25%, right? And so again, that goes to the truly, like, it's the frail, physiologically debilitated folks who are dying from this, which again is why half of the deaths in the US are from nursing home patients. Also, I just want to, in the world, so these are world numbers, around 600,000 people have supposedly died from this. And that's probably an overestimation by some standards and an underestimation by some standards, but I'm going to take the official tally at this point, without getting into the various scenarios where that might or might not be a little bit higher, a little bit lower truly. But 600,000 people, so a little over 500,000 people have died, right? And we're a little bit over halfway through the year. And so let's just double it. Again, this is very crude, but 1.2 million people die from this in the year 2020. Let's just pretend that. 60 million people die every year in the world. And so an approximately 1 million additional people, it's not as bad. And again, these are folks who are half dead already, who are dying. And so I just, again, I don't want to sound too callous, but I think when you look at these real numbers, I hope it takes away some of the fear. And so I will include the Worldometer link in the in the follow-up email. Also want to point out, you can go on to that website and look again at the official tallies for, I looked up Spain, Italy, New York, and Sweden. Sweden, because it was like one of the few countries that really didn't do much to lock itself down. And Spain and Italy and New York, because they've been kind of epicenters, major epicenters for very high rates. And every single one of those, as of this morning when I checked, or last night when I checked, they all did this. They all had those huge spikes. Spain, Italy, New York, I mean, they were all reaching up to about 1,000 deaths per day. And then they've all gone down over the last month or 2 months. And every single one of them is now at close to 0 deaths per day without any inkling of an uptick in deaths. Now, again, I don't care about cases because testing is becoming more and more prevalent. So I don't care about cases. Like almost everybody in the world is going to get infected with this at some point, long before any vaccine comes along and saves us all, right? So the only one that hasn't been way down for a long time was Sweden, which again did nothing in terms of, almost nothing in terms of locking things down. Even they, I mean, they've only had like 5,000 deaths in the entire country. So their max was not close to the 1,000 that it was in Spain, Italy, and New York. I want to say it was somewhere around maybe 100 deaths a day. And so they didn't like crash down to almost 0 deaths like the other places did, but they've just gone continuously down. And for the last week, they're actually also at, it was right around 0 deaths per day. And so, and yet I don't remember the exact seroprevalence or antibody positive tests in Sweden, but it wasn't that much. And so I'm hoping that this really holds true, and that those, if those places don't get much of a second spike or second wave, it's really going to support the idea that the true herd immunity threshold is probably somewhere in the 10, 15, 20, 25% range as it relates to antibodies, right? So I'm going to try not to dwell on that too much more. Feel free to ask me follow-up questions in the Q&A. But because of that, in California, I'm always like, what's going to happen around here locally in California, right? We really clamped down. Our governor, and at least in LA County, our mayor, really clamped us down. And so I think what it did was it really halted the spike, which was part of the point, right? But we started kind of coming down a little bit. We really never came out of it though. There was something along the lines of like, during that first month of the most deaths, it was maybe like 80 deaths a day in California. And then it probably came down to around 65 or 70 deaths a day, and kind of just stayed there for probably 6 to 8 weeks, I believe. And then it has definitely come up in the last week. It has definitely come up. It's actually probably higher than it was originally. But I think we just clamped down. So we're going to have a certain amount of a spike until we reach a herd immunity threshold similar to New York or Spain or Italy or Sweden, right? We have to reach that 10, 15, 20-ish% of antibody seroprevalence positivity. And we're not there yet. I should have done it for this talk. I forgot to. I feel like I calculated it out myself using the numbers, and like 4 weeks ago, we were at maybe 7 or 8%. So I think we in California really actually do need to go through a little bit of more of a spike. I suspect that 2 to 3 months from now, maybe even sooner than that, depending how clamped down we get, according to policies. I suspect that 1, 2, 3 months from now, I think California is going to go down to almost, I think our deaths per day are going to go way down. Again, do not look at cases per day. There's more and more testing. I mean, the governor had set a threshold of like wanting 60,000 tests, tests per day being done in California, and now it's like over 100,000 tests per day are being done in California. So you're going to pick up more and more cases. So don't look at the cases. You look at the deaths to really get a handle on it. So I hope I'm right. I hope it's just another month or 2 or 3, and then our deaths just go down in California. I hope. Honestly, time will tell. But that is my current theory, and I think it really plays off of the Spain, Italy, New York, Sweden data that we have, at least thus far. So I will leave that subject. What else did I want to talk about? Oh yeah, there's definitely, so this blood vessel disease that's occurring definitely is leaving some lasting effects, health effects on a subset of people who get COVID-19. Most of them tend to be like kind of a chronic fatigue syndrome, as well as lung issues. So that difficulty breathing seems to continue in a lot of people. I heard that there's an online kind of COVID-19, post-COVID-19 support group, and it's like 6,000 members strong, right? And so these people all have these kind of long-term sequelae. So, I don't want to kind of brush those aside. I want to recognize those. Again, long-term sequelae from viral infections, it can be tricky. I don't want to make it too lighthearted, but those can usually be treated, dealt with, or at least greatly improved with good quality care. How much is allopathic medicine going to be able to do about that? Probably not too much, probably about as much as they do with Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr virus, chronic EBV, right? So I don't have too much hope from an allopathic standpoint, but I definitely want to mention that those are real issues that a lot of people are experiencing, unfortunately. The issue of reinfection has been asked by a number of patients of mine, and certainly understandably so. There have been a couple of case reports about people who have been reinfected. That is, had multiple positive tests previously, and then went through this period where they were better and/or had negative testing done, and then have had symptoms again along with positive tests, right? And there's Dr. Daniel Griffin, who's in the East Coast, in New York area, I believe. He's on, I've mentioned it before a number of times, the podcast with the This Week in Virology podcast. Again, great podcast to get really good information. There's a few virologists who kind of banter back and forth, but also talk good science. And then they have guests. They have really high quality guests on it. And I think they're actually going to interview Anthony Fauci in a couple days. That's what I heard. So I look forward to listening to that one. But they have this clinician, Dr. Daniel Griffin, and he gives kind of a clinical update. I believe it's once a week on that podcast. And he's been at the forefront in New York. He mentioned like a month ago that he had treated over 2,000 cases legitimately, true positive cases. So he's got a lot of clinical information. At this point, it's probably more like 3,000 cases. And he's had 2 people who he believes got reinfected. He's a little bit worried about this, but 2 people out of 3,000 cases, not that all 3,000 cases are that far out, but you still got to kind of say, okay, well, there's probably 2,000 cases where it's been a while. People are like antibodies, true immunity, it always wanes. It wanes in every disease where antibodies are made. So a big question is, how fast does it wane in this? And it certainly looks like a few studies have suggested that it definitely does wane. So it's not surprising that it wanes. What's the question is, Does the T cell response, immunity response wane as well, or as much as the antibody response? And we're not going to have these answers for months, by the way. But so far, I would not be too concerned when he's reporting someone who's treated probably, maybe more than anybody else, any other clinician in the US, who's treated in terms of hospitalized patients at least. Where he's reporting 2 out of 3,000 or nearly 3,000 cases. It just doesn't seem very likely that that's going to be a major issue too soon. Now, might this be a once a year infection? Probably, but if it is, there's some concern that a second response might be worse than the first. That's not generally how it happens though. Usually the second and subsequent infections are always a little bit easier to deal with from a symptomatic clinical standpoint. Next topic, masks. And this is, so hugely charged. It's literally a Republican versus Democrat decision, it seems at this point, which is silly. And I would ask people to really take a moment when they, if you are on the masked side of things and you see an unmasked person, again, think about your cognitive bias, and vice versa. If you're an unmasked person and you see a masked person, like, pull politics out of this. Don't base this off of a president or a presidential candidate. Those are not the right people to be swaying your judgment on this. Science should be swaying your judgment on this. So my personal bias is that masks are not that useful. And there's some good studies that suggest masking might work a little bit. There's also, I would say, the preponderance of the evidence suggests that cloth masks do pretty much nothing. Kind of surgical masks like this right here that I wear a lot in the office do pretty much next to nothing. And that it's really the N95 masks or the like, only when they're properly fitted, that actually do truly limit infections. So again, this is, I think after every talk where I've said something along these lines, I get people emailing me cases that, or studies that prove that masks are more beneficial than not. And so I definitely look at all of those. There are certainly studies that suggest that. But I think most of the, I think the preponderance of the evidence truly suggests that anything short of a properly fitted N95 mask does very little. I will go back to, I think it's much more important to wear a mask if you're sick so that you don't spread those huge droplets all over the place. And keep just extremely good hygiene. And if you're sick, don't go out, don't go to grandma or grandpa's house, don't go to anyone who has any kind of health concerns. But that's just kind of being maybe a little bit more considerate than we ever were before. It's just kind of using common sense. But again, I will stand by, I don't know, 21 out of the last 25 mask studies that I've seen really suggest, again, that anything short of a properly fitted N95 mask does very little. I'll end that subject before I get too much hate mail. Testing, what do I want to say about testing? So TWIV, that podcast that I mentioned a short while ago, they had a great person on it yesterday on July 15th episode. It was actually a little bit mind-blowing to me, as well as the virologists who host the podcast. But it had, I forget his name, again, it's yesterday's episode. It's like a 2-hour episode. It's the main guest only talks for the first hour or so, so it's not that much time. But he was talking about this idea of having a $1 antigen testing, so a $1 basically it's really a $1 PCR test to test for actual infection. It would not be nearly as sensitive, but at $1 a day, if you were testing every day in certain situations like schools or businesses or sports, sporting teams, situations like that where there were where you need groups of people. If you were doing a $1 a day test, even if it was not that sensitive, well, the idea is, okay, even if I had it, if I tested negative today, well, tomorrow's test would probably pick it up because at some point it's going to pick it up. And I would encourage every one of you to go listen to that. There's a lot on there, a lot more than I can go over really quickly. But I think that in the current paradigm, okay, I'll back up. I will hold fast to this is a disease of malnutrition, and I think we should be addressing terrain. I think that's the true way to prevent this from ever becoming a deadly issue. But in today's paradigm, where masks, social distancing, and vaccines are the answer per governments and public policy, I think that doing something like this makes a lot of sense, because then you can pick people up when they're actually infectious. Because that's what we really care about from a public health standpoint is, hey, how do we catch that person who's actually infectious and let them know that they're infectious before they spread it, before they go to the store or the restaurant or a sporting, their sports team, or to school or something like that, which it's a huge issue as schools ponder how to reopen. I mean, it would just be mind-blowing to be able to do this, and we have the technology already. The bigger powers that be have not put enough emphasis on this, and I mean, listen to it. They just have some fantastic points, and it was a little bit mind-blowing for me of a concept, and I think it really fits this paradigm that we are in very well. Now, treatments, therapies, again, this is what I would consider for myself for a close loved one. I just want to emphasize again, we're not at war with a virus. Our human genome is 50% from virus downloads, as Dr. Zach Bush says. We've only, out of our OASIS population, we've certainly had people who tested positive for the antibodies, and many of them can look back and say, oh yeah, I was really sick and I had symptoms that fit the profile a month or 2 or 3 ago. But we've only had 2 active cases, and they were both actually people who got diagnosed elsewhere and then came here for kind of alternative treatment, right? Alternative therapies. And one was a youngish man with asthma. Another one was a 50-year-old man whose his O2 sats actually got down, I think, as low as 91%. I don't know if he's on this. I don't see him, but he yeah, so what did I do for them? In addition to, so the young man with asthma, I didn't treat him directly, so I feel like he was like 30. Kelly, our nurse practitioner, treated him, but he basically got an IV immune drip, which is mostly ascorbic acid, otherwise known as vitamin C, and IV glutathione. I believe he did that 2 days in a row, or maybe it was a treatment and then an off day and then again. And after the first one, reportedly, what I'm told is he just felt like gobs better just after right after the very first IV. The person who I treated, the 50 young middle 50ish man, I did the IV immune drip, which again is mostly IV vitamin C along with some vitamins and minerals, IV glutathione, and then the next day, I believe he got IV ozone. And then, I mean, I did what I've talked about before between zinc and vitamin D and andrographis, NAC, I had him on, and then steroids. A few of you sent me that Dr. Bartlett, I think he was in Texas, I forget his full name, video. That was really interesting. The inhaled steroid, the budesonide, which is, I think it's Pulmicort, is the brand name of it. But it's basically just inhaled steroids, which makes sense. I mean, get right to the original source of it and calm down that inflammation. It makes a lot of sense. And a short course of steroids inhaled has very little, potential long-term deleterious side effects. So I'm all on board. I actually had this person do some inhaled steroids as well. He totally has responded extremely well. That's what I have to say about that. There's an interesting study. I must have seen it right after my last talk, so this is probably 4 or 5 weeks old at this point. But it took an N of 212, so that's 212 people, broke them up into, okay, a quarter of them took like the first 50 who were critically ill, the second 50 who had what they called categorized as severe illness, COVID-19 illness, and then a moderate and then a mild. And there's a nice graph put together, and what was really stunning was a level of vitamin D of over 20. I think it's nanograms per ml, if I'm not mistaken. Basically only 4%. So again, there were 49 people in that arm with the mild symptoms, and 47 out of 49 of them had vitamin D levels over 30. For the moderate, severe, and critically ill people, which basically was 150-ish people, it was almost flipped. Almost none of them had levels above 30 for vitamin D. I don't think I talked about this on the last one. It's a very interesting correlation that I think speaks very loudly. I'm not saying it's only about vitamin D, but again, when 47 out of 49 people with mild symptoms have vitamin D levels over 30, and then it's almost completely flipped in people with moderate, severe, or critical have levels less than 30. I don't know, that's a correlation that's seems too strong to ignore. So I'd say at the very least, in addition to clean air, clean water, clean food, clean thinking, get some sunlight and get your vitamin D levels tested. And if the sunlight's not quite getting you up to a good level, take some vitamin D with some vitamin K2 to get your levels above 30, and probably for this year, get it above 40. Don't go too much above 50 or 60 though. There's been some great, I'm not gonna get long-winded here, so I'm not going to go over the ozone, but there's been some really good ozone data. I still just full-heartedly believe in ozone. We are going to, I'm like seriously committed. I thought we'd already have it, but we're going to have some blood cleansing that's mainly ozone, a new technique available in our office very, very soon that I'm super stoked about. Hydroxychloroquine, for all of the hoopla about it, I will still hold steady. I am totally on the hydroxychloroquine with zinc bandwagon. I think there's too much data to not consider it. There's a great one out of Henry Ford 2,500 patients, basically halved the death rate for people who got it as soon as they were hospitalized. Again, I think it still needs to be done with zinc. There was a couple of negative studies, but those were, I mean, the people who designed those studies should be in a moment of unloved state. I'm going to say they should be shot because they killed people when they triple or quadruple dosed hydroxychloroquine. They took the upper level and then literally quadrupled the dose. And they're saying, oh, this is really harmful, or it's not saving people, or more people are dying who are in the treatment group. Well, that's just, I mean, that's it. There's no words to describe how stupid that study, and there was two of them. I forget where they were. One of them was out of England, and it was just atrocious studies. So I am still on the hydroxychloroquine zinc bandwagon. Again, if some good data comes out, actual good data that suggests it's not useful, I'm happy to jump off of that bandwagon. I don't own stock in it. So I'm totally open to being proven wrong on that one. But for now, I'm still on it. I will say that hospitalizations, hospitals have gotten so much better at treating this condition. Previously, whereas like 80% of people who were dying who got on the ventilator, now it's 20, 30%, and it just has to do with they're using steroids in the right way. Remdesivir, which is like $3,500 for like a 5-day course, does help the truly sick people. But again, it's intravenous and it's really only for critically ill people. It's not, that's not a scalable drug. And it's ridiculously expensive. Just the way they're proning people, great. They're using NAC, which is Mucomyst in the hospital. And then there's a number of other drugs that are being looked at, drugs that have been around already for many years are being looked at. So again, I mean, to go from literally like an 80% death rate when you're intubated to, maybe a 20 or 30% death rate, it's still an obnoxiously high number of people who go on and die, but it's a huge improvement. It's already 3 o'clock. I will just say other great things if you get infected, if I get infected, I mean, melatonin, nebulizer, I'm still gonna be on that bandwagon. If I had a lung condition, I would strongly consider nebulizing. Ion, sea minerals like every day. If I were treating myself, inhaled glutathione, the budesonide, the steroids would certainly be considered. I think, and I said this before, but Zach Bush has really put together an impressive argument about air pollution. A really nice study came out. I just saw it today for the first time. Interestingly, it supposedly doesn't come out until July 20th. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's really interesting out of China, linking air pollution to COVID-19 cases and severity. I think Zach Bush is definitely onto something. And so the question is, at least for those of you who are online who live in LA, myself included, it's like, okay, we live in kind of a crappy air environment. So what do? I would say it's really important to get a high quality air purifier. Forgive me if I mentioned this last time, but for your bedroom, a high quality air purifier for the bedroom, because assuming you're in there a quarter to a third, maybe even a little bit longer every day. Well, if you can spend a third of your day breathing high quality, clean, non-toxic air that does not have cyanide in it, you're probably going to go a very long ways towards improving your terrain, improving your respiratory terrain, but your entire terrain, because what you breathe in disseminates to your body very, very quickly. Ion with food to minimize the glyphosate. Again, that's another kind of Zach Bush thing. I think it's brilliant. One doctor in Texas, I forget his name, but he's using CBD, lisinopril, hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin. So he's kind of using that hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, and then adding on a lisinopril and CBD. And he claims out of hundreds and a couple of his colleagues who are using that. And it sounds like they just slam everybody on that exact protocol, and they say they haven't had a single person go to the hospital out of hundreds. So that's kind of interesting. I'm going to skip over that. So this is a blood vessel disease. I think it's worth coming back to that, week 1, how week 2 is a little bit different in terms of how it's more of a respiratory issue. And so that's when you really might think about that inhaled glutathione, inhaled steroids, and NAC. NAC is a capsule. I put a lot of people on it very often, including that fella who I treated for COVID-19. And again, his oxygen saturations were getting down into 90, and he's by all standards, very healthy relatively healthy before that. Week number 3, it being a clotting issue, you're talking about using things that kind of thin the blood, right? And so the allopathic treatments are warfarin or Lovenox. There's a couple other ones out there, but those would be your standard ones if you were in a hospital. But here, I would consider something like aspirin. If you can tolerate aspirin, don't give aspirin to children though, or I would not give aspirin to my children. I use something called Masszymes here. Masszymes is one of the strongest enzyme blends we have. And when it's taken on an empty stomach, it really chews up the inflammatory coagulative proteins. So it can help to keep your blood thin in a healthy manner. Yeah, and then I just, week 4, it being kind of the post-viral, like ozone is what I would be doing on myself. Vaccines, real quickly, try to wrap this up in like 5 or 10 minutes. Vaccines, I'm still going to go back to don't wait around for them. You can run from this virus, but you can't hide. You really can't, masked or unmasked. Treat your terrain so that you don't have to worry about this virus. Vaccines are speeding along at warp speed, pun intended. There are, I believe, around the world, there's like 23 companies that have human trials ongoing at this point. They have been able to compress a typical vaccine. What would have taken 6 years has taken 6 months now. So they're doing some incredible things. I mean, some incredibly stupid things. I'm going to include a very good podcast in the show notes with Ari Whitten, who is a phenomenal person. He's very much holistic minded, but the way he takes out the bias is beautiful. He asks extremely talented, scientifically talented questions, and he interviews Dr. Tenpenny on there about vaccines. It's wonderful. And so I'm going to include that, but Peter Hotez and Paul Offit, who are both 2 of the biggest vaccine proponents, have serious concerns, mainly around how a vaccine might induce autoimmunity down the road. I'll just say, I think the Hib vaccine is a fantastic vaccine. I said it before, I'm not anti-vaccine, I'm more about better science. And there's a lot left out of the typical the discussion on vaccines when it comes to mainstream medicine. And there was a vaccine act in 2005 that was much worse than the 1986 one, where just like, mark my words, anybody who goes into any one of these trials, and then anyone outside of the trials, once they start giving it to the public, not a single person will be able to who is injured from these vaccines will be able to reap any dime, not 1 penny. These companies have complete immunity, pun intended, from any kind of consequences. And that's scary. Now, having said that, I do think the FDA, after listening to what they're looking for, is doing a pretty good job. FDA, NIH, I can't remember who's in charge of all the vaccine makers, at least in the US at this moment. But they're trying to do a good job. I just don't think it's going to be enough, because it's coming at it very much from the mainstream medicine side. the goal is of those studies, of those human trials, is there antibodies being made? And just because an antibody is made doesn't mean it's a neutralizing antibody, and it doesn't mean that even that neutralizing antibody is going to be useful or at a high enough level, or maybe it's too high of a level where it actually ends up giving autoimmunity. And the T cell response is totally left out of the testing and the potential therapy response. Just as a reminder, the MERS and the SARS-1, those were both 99% gone within 12 months. The rest of the coronaviruses are common colds. And the prior coronavirus vaccines have kicked up a cytokine storm in autoimmunity that were too dangerous to approve those vaccines. The flu shot still, as far as I can tell, makes coronavirus infection more likely. So, are you going to get a flu shot this year? I'll leave that up to you, but I just want to kind of throw that out there again. I just looked up right before this the Moderna mRNA vaccine because they released their data from the phase 1. They released that data I think it was just 2 days ago. Let me back up though, before I lose this line of thinking. For any vaccine to actually be ready come January or February, or even maybe December, a company is going to have to start making and manufacturing the vaccine before they ever even get approval. That's just the amount of time that is needed for the human studies, even though their human studies are insufficient. A company is going to have to bank, like Pfizer is going to have to bank that they're gonna, win the vaccine race, and they're gonna have to make whatever it is, 100 million, 300 million doses before they ever get the approval. And I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Keep that in mind. So anyways, back to the Moderna vaccine. Their phase 1 was 45 people, open trial, 15 got a low dose, 15 of them got a medium dose, and 15 got a high dose. I think the 15 in the low dose did not generate enough antibody, they thought. The 15 in the high dose, too many people had major side effects, so they're not doing the high dose. The medium dose, 15 out of 15 had what they're calling mild side effects. Maybe they truly are mild. I don't want to let my bias too much into this, but they named fatigue, chills, headache, and muscle pain. 15 out of 15 of them had one or multiple of those symptoms. So, I mean, I don't know. Anyways, they're starting a 30,000 patient phase 3 trial at the end of this month. So good luck to those 30,000 people. I'm gonna skip the rest of my vaccine part. Want to try to get you out of here. Again, just kind of in summary, I'll put together or re-say a few thoughts. There are no new strains of this. There's been no genetic drift, which is good for a potential vaccine. Again, I hope, I don't want to be too sarcastic, I hope one of the vaccines ends up being really therapeutic and without too many side effects. And so the fact that it hasn't drifted yet, it does bode well for a vaccine, just in that regard. This virus it's going to catch you before a vaccine. Chances are it's going to catch you before the vaccine comes out, whether it's December of 2020 or December of 2021. What is that herd immunity threshold? I hope I am right in that California just needed some time to catch up, and that a month, 2 months, 3 months from now, we go down to almost 0 deaths, like New York, like Italy, like Spain, like Sweden. Hopefully there's not a second wave, because they have already reached herd immunity threshold. Or if there are more cases, if there truly is an uptick in actual percentage of positive cases, hopefully enough of the people have already had some type of immunity to the point where the percentage of deaths will actually be less, right? So maybe there will be a second wave, but it won't be as severe of a wave in terms of actual deaths. You know, last time I mentioned we should not be flattening the curve. We really need to bend the curve. And the whole point is focus on your terrain. I think that's the answer to true prevention. But again, to fit into current mainstream paradigm, I think that TWIV episode yesterday that talked about a potential $1 a day test could really help us open things up and help our economy and make the 1.1 billion people that are estimated to go hungry in the coming year, you know, lessen that burden. I mean, we're shutting things down without thinking about the long-term consequences. I think politicians are too concerned about whether they're reelected. And I'm not just talking about the president, I'm talking about politicians at every level and every, you know, no matter which way they lean, because at the end of the day, the governors, the mayors, they're leaning towards their constituents, and that's why it's different. That's why policies are different in different states. I promise I will wrap this up. Yeah, so on you know, this is a disease of malnutrition. It's a disease of malnutrition of vitamins, minerals, a poor gut microbiome. A lot of medications deplete certain minerals, minerals and vitamins. It's a different mineral or different vitamin depending on the medications. There's poison, there's glyphosate in our water, food, so many poisons in the air, the cyanide specifically. For that reason, again, I'm going to say ion liquid to help with food, to help the glyphosate. I think that's really important. I think an air purifier, I actually just finally purchased one. I had wanted to do this before the whole COVID-19 thing. I just finally got my butt in gear and actually purchased 3 for our office. Supposedly they kill 99.9% of the virus, including a one similar to SARS-CoV-2. So you all are safe. But I wanted to do that just from a air pollution standpoint anyways for our office, because inside air is so polluted. And in LA, outside air is so polluted. So I think getting an air purifier, I'll put the one that I chose in the show notes as well. But an air purifier while you sleep is probably a really good idea. Organic food, clean, you know, clean water, sunlight for the vitamin D. And whether you're controlling elevated blood pressure, elevated sugar, liver disease, kidney disease, obesity, like if you're obese, go on a crash diet, like that just keeps you less obese for the next few months, right? But like treat those conditions, and whether it's naturally or by pharmaceuticals, just treat those conditions, like improve your odds, improve your chances. You know, you all are like, I can scroll across here and I can see, and all of you are such powerful human beings and powerful souls, and you all have the ability to become super healthy from a physically physiologic standpoint. And so I just encourage you to grab your power. And again, don't watch the news. They only show what sells, and that's fear and anxiety, because that gets you hooked and drives up their ratings. They're not going to tell you anything you don't already know. So stop watching it. Take care of your terrain, and take care of, you know, stand for other people's terrains also, not just your own, but stand for other people's terrains and do it in a really loving sort of way and lead by example. And again, another shameless plug, Tracy, our health coach, and Kelly Kell, our nurse practitioner, they had a really awesome group session last time. You know, it was our first time, and it was kind of half in person, half Zoom. So there were a few hiccups for sure, but you know, the general feedback was really phenomenal in terms of material and support. And they're going to start a new one I think it's in like 2 or 3 weeks. So call up the office if you're interested. It's going to be on the gut microbiome, which is like, that's worth 3/4, 75% of your immune system is in your gut, starts in your gut. So it's very key for this time. And go be kind and be wonderful human beings. And I'm going to be quiet now and open it up for questions. So go ahead, and if you can figure out how, go ahead and raise your hand. And if no one's talking, go ahead and just unmute yourself. But let's try to raise hands if possible.
I don't think you could see my hand, Dr. Ram.
Hi, who's this?
This is Virginia Tullius.
Hi, Virginia.
Hi, I have two short questions, I believe. The first is, I couldn't quite understand the website you were saying for the July 15th episode. Could you say that again?
Yes, I will include it. I will include a link in the follow-up email, although that might not come out for a couple days. It's a podcast, and it's called TWIV, which stands for This Week in Virology.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, TWIV, This Week in Virology.
Okay, and my second question is, let's see what I had right here. Okay, if a vaccine comes out and a person does not want to take it, I've never taken the flu vaccine and I've done great. Do you believe they will be forcing it upon us?
I mean, I know that I've read somewhere that New York has already put into action some kind of legislation where they basically have the ability to just kind of press the green button to mandate a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Now, you know, I'm unclear what that entails. Like, is that 100% of the New York population, or is that, you know, all people going back to schools, or is that all people participating in sports teams? You know, the question is that 100% of people in New York, or is that a certain segment of the population? I don't know. And I will just throw out there, I didn't mention this, I don't think, but in the Moderna trial and all the other ones, as far as I am concerned, maybe slightly different age cutoffs, but in the Moderna trial, they only took the healthiest of the healthy people for those trials. So, I mean, what are the side effects going to be like in someone in the average population, right? The average U.S. population is not very healthy. So that'll be interesting. They also only took up to 55, which, I mean, that's not who dies. Now, again, I don't want to come off as like 100% of people who die are only unhealthy people. Occasionally lightning strikes and somebody who's healthy, maybe somebody like myself who's pretty healthy overall, might die, but life happens and death happens. So I just, from the vaccine standpoint though, they've only gone up to 55 in that initial stages, which is, I don't know, it's interesting. So I don't know much more than that about mandating. I've certainly heard a lot. I don't know. We'll see. I sure hope not. I think that would be one of the greatest mistakes in human history.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Sure. You're welcome. Anybody else?
So this is Misha.
Hi, Misha.
How are you doing today?
Excellent.
So this kind of goes on along with the terrain theory kind of approach. But one thing I've noticed with the people being afraid of the virus is they started sanitizing everything. And the little research that I've done on sanitizers in looking at the industrial type, which largely use, and also now are on the shelves of Sprouts, so it's not just industrial type, use quaternary ammoniums, which leave residues, which there's very little research on chronic exposure. And I can only imagine that the incidence of use has increased exponentially, and we're exposed exponentially, potentially, than we were before. And I'm just wondering if you guys have given any thought to that, what you guys use in the office, just as a thought too, just to give alternatives to people, maybe if they're not sure what would be safe to use, what leaves residues, what does not leave residues, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. In the office, we use, sometimes we use silver, sometimes we use just regular alcohol. We have something else. I don't really do it. In my room, I use silver mostly. We have a third solution. But yeah, we try to keep it healthy. Oh, hydrogen peroxide. I mean, those are very healthy, reasonable things that don't tend to leave too much harmful residue. Yeah, it's a huge concern. I mean, from a terrain standpoint, sterilizing everything, it's only going to create sicker people down the road because we're supposed to be exposed to microbes in our environment. And nowadays, I mean, people's microbiomes are getting worse and worse, no doubt.
Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to raise that awareness in people that when you're hearing it's being cleaned, it's being sanitized, it means they're wiping down surfaces with this substance. Grocery
Yeah.
carts. If you work at a place that they're like, we're cleaning it extra,
Yeah.
5 times a day, and that they have linked. The only study I could find was done on mice, and it impacted their fertility, which is in fact why they even did the study, because they noticed the fertility drop, and they're like, why? Let's do a study. And then I have seen suggestions that occupational asthma can be increased due to the usage of these chemicals. So those are very limited research otherwise. And the MSDS sheet says exactly that. No available information, even though it's a health hazard of 3. So just wanted that awareness out there that that's a danger.
No, thank you for sharing that. It completely makes sense and completely agree. And I'm glad you brought that up. I actually, when I go to shop, when I go to grocery shop, they do the whole wipe down thing. And then I actually take a wet wipe and then wipe off their crap. That's whatever they're using to sanitize. That's what I do because I completely get where you're coming from and I don't want to touch that stuff.
I grabbed one out of the parking lot.
Yeah, nice. All right. Any other questions?
Dr. Ram? Hi.
This is Krista.
Yes, it's Lauren. I have a quick question about traveling by airplane and what can be done to decrease someone's exposure risk aside from masks.
Yeah, I would. So the way we get infected is almost exclusively between here and here, right? And so I've mentioned before the zinc lozenge. I think that's an exquisite thing to use because it completely coats all that oral mucosa and upper respiratory mucosa. And then, mouthwash. That was the other one. Because those viruses, they tend to go in, and sure, if you're breathing in aerosolized viral particles, some of them are going to go down deeper into your respiratory tract. But most of the viruses, we really get infected from the back of the throat and forward. And so if you use a little bit of mouthwash, and that could be hydrogen peroxide or your good old Listerine filled with green dye, green, yellow number, whatever, and green number, whatever. But some mouthwash is probably also really good at doing the trick. So between a mouthwash, a zinc lozenge, and an N95 mask, if possible, that's what I would do. And then, I mean, that's where I would consider other things like some if I were taking a plane trip, like an andrographis, that would probably do it. You could also inhale if you have a nebulizer on the other end, and they sell very cheap handheld nebulizers on Amazon. You can inhale any one of those things I've mentioned before, like silver or hydrogen peroxide, because those are extremely antiviral. So, and that's going to get the entire respiratory and the upper oral tract. So that would be just an exquisite way to greatly minimize risk.
And in terms of that person returning home, do you think that they should be quarantined if there are high-risk people within the family? Or if they take those measures, is that not necessarily? needed?
Yeah, if you, so you can transmit it either because you're infective or as a fomite. So even if I'm not infective, if someone like say I have a patient who's infected and they, slap me on the back and then I go see a friend soon thereafter and give them a hug and they kind of wipe my back and then they wipe their nose, right? I'm going to act as the fomite, just the carrier of that virus as a surface, as if I was a doorknob as well. And so if you can be pretty sure that you're not infective, and you basically just shower, take a really good bath or a really good shower, like the chances that you're gonna give that to somebody is very, very limited. Right now, while I would love that $1 rapid test to come along where you get results very rapidly within 10, 15 minutes as well, that would be ideal. That will hopefully be available in the future. Currently, though, you'd really have to get a swab, a nasal swab or an oropharyngeal swab done and get those results back. If you get 2 results back that are negative, and you've showered as well, the likelihood that you become infective is pretty low. So I think that without symptoms and 2 negative tests 48 hours apart, but also done, how should I explain this, like 5 days after you may have been exposed, like you're pretty much not going to be effective. In other words, if I fly from New York back here, back home, like the one sure way would be to, assuming on the flight I was doing the zinc and did some inhaled whatever, and then waited a few days and then had a PCR test, and then 48 hours had a PCR test. And if both of those are negative, you're good to go. So is a 14-day necessary? No, a 14-day is probably not necessary. It's going to be it's not going to be that much more yielding than like a 5 or 7 day period. Now, none of that is official, so take it with a grain of salt, but this is the way I would think about it. Again, if I were going to see a loved one who, was at risk. Does that offer any clarity? I know that was kind of confusing, but.
It does. It's my husband's traveling and my child is high risk, so that's why I'm curious.
That's a tough one. I mean, if I were the one traveling and my kid had a respiratory issue or something, like I would do the zinc. I would be really good about just keeping good hygiene when I was out and about. You keep good hygiene and do those few things, the likelihood that you're going to be infectious or catch something is extremely low. And even without a quarantine at the end, again, the chances that I would transfer that are extremely low. The testing scenario and the additional 5 to 7 day quarantine is, I don't think that's really necessary. Those things are put into place because the public at large is very horrible at carrying out, instructions, right? And so the public policies are aimed at the general public. But if you're kind of thinking things through on an individual basis, to me, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you so much. It's very helpful.
Sure. Who else has a hand? Julianne. Julianne. Yep, let me try unmuting you. All right, I think you're on.
Yeah. I wrote you a personal question about a personal medical event in my life that's going on. And I thought I misheard what this lecture was going to be all about. I didn't realize I thought it was more just about the immune system. And so I'm just wondering if you'll have time to answer that, or
this is not going to be an appropriate place for like really personal health questions.
Uh-huh.
This is a time for more general questions that would be interesting to everyone.
Yeah. So I misinterpreted and thought that you would be handling the question today, but you weren't. And but I would like the name of the air purifier you got. I think
Yeah, it's
most people have left the call.
yeah. I bought the Molecule. It's Molecule with a K. It's molecule.com, and I I'm pretty sure if once you buy one, you can send a coupon code to someone else, and you get $50 and they get $50 off. So full disclosure, I'll include that in the email, but it's a way for you to get $50, or if you want to just go buy one now and then you can send it on to other people
Well, I
and
see.
you get
You're going to be
$50 off.
sending all of us an email.
Yeah, much of the pertinent info I'll try to send along, but it's from the molecule.com website. Again, I'll include that, and if anybody wants to get it, it should be $50 off from my understanding. I've never done it. I just found that out when I purchased the ones for the office yesterday. Okay.
Called MOLEKU.
Correct. And then le.com. Yeah. And that will be on the email.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I admire how assiduously you are tracking this data for your clients.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And let's see. I think Mary Nance. Mary Nance. I will unmute you. Or let me try to unmute you. Yeah, there we are. Oh, did I
Okay,
do it?
a question and a comment. Question, we use white vinegar to sterilize and clean.
Mhm.
Are we good with that?
You should be good with that.
Okay, and then the colloidal silver came up, and I use colloidal silver as a mouthwash, and I have a nasal spray, and that's for my personal cleansing. I really rely on that. And for those out there that are willing, you can make your own, and there are generators available online that you can do your research, because you want tiny, 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 tiny particles.
Yeah, you want tiny particles. You don't want crappy silver. It can turn you blue, which there's a little bit of debate about if that's dangerous or not. It may or it may not be. But
it's easy
probably,
to make your own.
Yeah.
It's just terribly simple.
So anybody who tries that, though, just make sure you do it well.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank
Any
you.
questions?
Dr. Ron,
Who are we talking to?
this is Miriam. I don't have a picture up, sorry.
Okay. Hi, Miriam.
Hi. Quick question. So the vaccines never generate a T cell response. They only generate those antibody B cell response.
There's different vaccine platforms, meaning basically different vaccine technologies, and they all work a little bit. Well, many of them work differently, and the issue is partially that they just don't track the T cells typically, because that's not kind of the standard that has been set. So the standard that has been set is merely to test and look for antibodies, preferably neutralizing antibodies. And so it's just not part of the vaccine industry. It's just not what they do. So whether they're testing for it and just not making that info available typically, I do not know, but that's not the goal of the vaccine, is not to address the T cell response.
Okay. And natural stuff that would get the T cell response is the stuff you've talked about, like the zincs or the andrographis and stuff like that.
All of that. I mean, it's all, the better your terrain, the better your health, the better
Right.
you're able to fight off any infection.
Right, I
This
know.
one is kind of no different, right? It's
Right.
just simply have a good terrain so that your immune system kicks in, but doesn't kick in too much, which is
Right.
autoimmunity, right?
Okay.
It creates a cytokine storm that can kill you.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
sure. Debbie. I just, there you go.
Okay, Helen, just to clarify that earlier question as far as infectious, because they're always talking about how infectious and how easily spread this is.
Mhm.
If you get infected on a certain day, could you infect somebody else on that day without knowing it? Or does it actually take like 2 days for it to grow in your body to be enough to reinfect somebody else? Is that where you got that number 2 in that previous question?
Yeah, you can only infect someone else that same day by acting as the doorknob, right?
Okay.
So you can't get exposed to it, have it go into your respiratory system, and then your body literally, the virus has to go in, kind of hijack your cells and start making a bunch of itself to the point where you're actually coughing or spewing it out yourself, and sneezing or coughs or saliva as you kind of touch your mouth and then touch something else. That takes days to occur. It seems like people are probably only infectious for about a 2 to 3 day period, as far as I'm understanding. Now, that goes in kind of stark contrast to what's been maybe said a lot, and that is because the PCR test, when it's set at a certain threshold, really picks up little pieces of this virus. But you know, on that TWIV episode yesterday, if you listen to it, you'll hear their analogy. It's kind of like a serial killer is out serial killing and then, you know, dies in a police shootout, and that serial killer is buried. And then a year later, you go back and you dig it up and you find a piece of the hair and measure it, and it turns out there's DNA there. Well, the serial killer is dead, right? The virus is dead. Just because you're picking up pieces of it on a PCR test and have a positive test on a sheet of paper does not mean you are infectious. And that's a lot of what's happened. It seems like most everybody is infectious for probably 2 to 3 days. And if you're symptomatic, it's probably day 5 to day 8-ish, 5-ish to day 8-ish of symptoms where you're actually infectious. Yeah, I was going to go somewhere else. I forgot. Got too inside my own head, down the rabbit hole. Hopefully that answered something.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right. It's hard being too smart for my own good. Total joke. Who else? Anybody else have any questions? Carolyn.
Oh. I didn't catch when you were talking about the progression of the disease, and I didn't catch what you said week 1 was. Week 2, respiratory, week 3, clotting.
Yeah, week 1 is just kind of the general symptoms that you think of when you go on the CDC website and look at the list of symptoms. It's kind of, okay, you're symptomatic, which might include, you know, fatigue, it might include a fever. Although a number of studies have shown that fever is not a very good predictor. So all this measuring of temperatures is probably a little bit more to make us feel good about ourselves than actually good, decent science. But you know, that shortness of breath can certainly come up in the first week. It's more that the week 2 being a respiratory, it's more like, okay, your saturations are actually going down, right? Maybe they go down a little bit. You know, an O2 sat of 97, 98, 99 is normal. Once you get to 96, you know, that starts being non-optimal. Once you're getting below 92, that's really non-optimal. So like the patient, he was getting down to 90, I think 90, he definitely got down to at least 91. You know, that was a little bit more concerning. That's when I suggested he start the steroids actually, and do the IV ozone. And then he came back. Now, was it from the IV ozone or the steroids or a combination of both? Who knows? But he's better now.
Okay. Thank you. Great.
Yeah. Anybody else?
This is Sandy, Dr. Ram. I don't have a picture either, sorry.
Okay, hi Sandy.
Hi. When you're talking about the terrain, I just had a couple of questions about that.
Yeah.
With the vitamin D, my understanding was that even if you're taking it and you want to try to get your vitamin D level up, it can take a few months. Is that right? And if so, is there a certain kind that you recommend over another type or anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I've never been a fan of getting vitamin D up super quickly, because I've definitely seen patients' laboratory numbers where their vitamin Ds are too high. So I don't like to do that. I prefer to go low and slow, typically. However, given the data, albeit limited data that we're seeing, I kind of encourage getting vitamin D levels up if yours is low. And so vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, so it just needs to be taken with food that has some decent amount of protein and fat. It'll allow your body to actually absorb that vitamin D. And if my vitamin D were a level of 15 or something, I would consider probably taking 10,000, and I didn't have symptoms, I would consider taking 10,000 a day, for maybe as much as a month. That would get it up, that should get it up pretty nice, again, with food. A lot of times people will recommend taking like 50,000 units. So you could take 50,000 IUs or units, or I could take 50,000 units for 3 days in a row, and then cut it back to 10,000 units a day for a few weeks and then test. But it is a fat-soluble vitamin. So typically without taking those high doses, it will take a while for your levels to get up. Yes.
Yeah, that's probably been my issue. Plus, I'm like pretty much never in the sun, especially now that we're all locked down.
Yeah,
but
it's a huge issue, and it should include vitamin K2 with it. There's a very important balance there, and people have probably been doing themselves harm by taking just vitamin D for a while now.
Oh, okay. And does that have to be in a proportion together, like as far as how much?
At this point, I would just say as long as there's some vitamin K2 in it, you probably don't need to get too worried about the exact quantity. So just make sure there's some vitamin K2 in it. Yeah.
Okay. And the other two questions are concepts that you mentioned were the clean water and the ion liquid. So I just was curious, like what do you consider clean water? How do you get your clean water? And then you mentioned ion liquid, and I don't know if that has something to do with the vitamins too.
Yeah, ion liquid it was formerly called Restore. It is it's molecules that are from old parts of the earth that create a communication network for your microbiome, and in the laboratory under the microscope literally helps heal gap junctions or leaky gut within minutes. And that's whether you're eating a gluten-rich pizza that was not organic, was not non-GMO, and had tons of glyphosate in it. Like, you eat that, your gut will become leakier. Even the healthiest of guts will become leaky. And somehow taking this ion liquid right around your bites of this hypothetical slice of glutenized glyphosate will greatly minimize and diminish that leaky gut. So it's basically creating a much healthier terrain, gut terrain. So that it's really useful, and it can actually be inhaled. It's great for sinus infections. It's great for lung infections just in general. So I'm a huge proponent of that. It's probably one of the I'm actually, a lot of people think I like to prescribe supplements. I'd actually don't like prescribing too many supplements because I'd rather people get nutrition from their natural environment. But the ion is one of the couple supplements that I think almost everybody in the US should be on. It's that potentially powerful. And then for clean water, at the end of the day, just get some filter. Some filter is better than no filter, and is probably going to take out, a good 95% of the toxins. So if you can decrease by a toxin load in the water by 20-fold, don't get too wrapped up on getting your best bang for your buck or looking for the perfect water filter. Just get some filtered water. Preferably not bottled water though, or not plastic bottled water. That is toxic too. plastics in the body don't do anything good long term.
It's actually better, you think, to get water like maybe out of my fridge that's filtered than it would be to buy plastic water bottles.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, that's my take on it, at least.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, Dr. Ram. Can you hear me?
Yes, who is this?
This is Erica, but it says Monica.
Oh, hi. Hi, Erica, Monica.
I want to know how you're feeling about the antibody testing that's out now, and are you still using the same one in your office?
Yeah, we're still using Quest, which we've been doing for a couple months now. I mean, when it comes to measuring antibodies, it is still allegedly, in the Southern California region, it is still 99.9% supposedly sensitive and specific, and does not cross-react with the other coronaviruses. So in my book, that counts as a pretty dang good antibody test. Now, does it measure those people who don't mount antibody tests or responses, but still had COVID? No, it definitely does not do anything for measuring that.
Okay.
And it is only IgG test, so it does not test IgM, which is the more immediate that can be present during an actual infection, potentially.
So that's a different test than the one you were doing before from the...
The one I was doing before was from ViraCore, which measured both IgG and IgM antibodies. Had no cross-reactivity, which was a large part of the reason I chose it at the time, because it was literally one of the only ones out there that didn't cross-react with the common cold coronaviruses. But the sensitivity and specificities, depending on which one you're talking about, they were both only like 95 or 96 point something sensitive and or specific for that, both the IgG and IgM. So it was decent, but it wasn't as good as 99.9. The ViraCore also gave levels, and so if someone wants to do that test, we can still do it. We've done it for a couple of people who just wanted to know. That's not a free test. I forget what, I think it's like $125 or something. But the ViraCore also gave a level, so they'd have a cutoff of say 9, and if someone was 6, well, they'd call it negative, but at least you knew it was 6 and not 0. Also, maybe, some people could come back at 50. Well, then you mounted a pretty good response, right? Versus if 9 was the cutoff and you only had a 12, well, you know that that immunity is probably going to wane a little bit over the coming weeks to months, and that if you retested 2 months later, you'd probably come back negative, even though you used the same test. Hopefully that made sense.
Yes, okay. And so I assume the Quest one takes insurance, unlike the other one.
Yeah, the Quest one takes insurance. So unless I think if you have 0 insurance, there's a cost, which I don't even know what it is. I feel like it's like $40 or something, but could be totally off though. But anyone with any insurance, Kim's the best person to ask for that, but I'm pretty sure anyone with insurance can get it basically for free.
Okay, sounds
And I'll
good.
tell you, I have PPO insurance. I ran it on myself, and my insurance did not charge me a dime, and I had not met my deductible. So I do have firsthand experience that supposedly the government is paying for my antibody test.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Any other questions, or are we done?
I have a
Doc.
question. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Gretchen, is that you?
No, this is Vicky.
Oh, hi, Vicky.
Hi, I had a quick question. Do the labs that do the testing, do they report positive cases to an agency, some sort of state or federal?
Yes.
For
Yeah,
example,
they do that.
I
We
had the
don't do
ViraCore
that.
test, so
Yeah, I believe in the beginning it was not clear You know, in March, it was definitely not clear what would happen to information. Even in April, it was not clear. At this point, though, it's pretty clear that labs are required to report their results to whatever institutions they report them to. Yeah, we don't report anything at Oasis, but the labs that actually run those tests are supposed to. And
Okay.
allegedly, it's without any personally identifying data, allegedly.
Okay, so that's, you don't know that for sure. Do you, and you don't know that which agencies they report to? Just curious.
I don't. I would assume that it's to the local public health department because that's where, like, other communicable diseases that we get positive tests to, we are, like me as a doctor, I'm supposed to report it to our local public health agency. So like myself, I could do it to either the Pasadena one or the Long Beach one. I don't have to report anything to the CDC. At the laboratory level though, I'm not positive about that. I know what I have to do. I know I don't have to, as a primary care doctor, I don't have to do any reporting. Now, I used to have to do that, but now the labs, again in March when everything was a fiasco, we were supposed to, but now all the labs are supposed to handle that. And I'd bet a little bit of money. I wouldn't bet a lot of money, but I'd bet a little bit of money that it's to the local public health department. Again, though, if ViraCor, they were an East Coast based company. So, I don't, like, do they report that to their local public health? I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for not being able to answer that question better. Anybody else? Brad?
Yeah, hey Doc, how are you?
Yeah, good.
Good. Two questions. One, as far as, I read it a few months ago that they had some promising results about antibody treatments that supposedly didn't have any side effects, and they were just doing some more research. But with the idea is that people take the antibodies and it would protect you prophylactically, but you would have to take it. They weren't sure how long it would last, maybe 2-3 months, and then you would have to take more antibodies. But have you heard anything more than that? Because I damn sure would never take a vaccine, but if that's something that, I don't know, I do want to get your take on that.
I did hear something about that. I think it was actually on one of those TWIV episodes, and it seems like that's not turning out to be a very good therapy. Although it might have helped some people, it seems like it's not an overall a great answer. It's not a great answer because that's way too cost prohibitive, number one, to treat people at a large scale, to like have all those people basically come back for a blood transfusion and then do that to the sick person. But just from a clinical standpoint, it seems like it's not actually that good of a therapy as well. I think part of that is because, there's other proteins that get into those packs of antibodies. And, how does that play into if someone's sick and in the middle of a cytokine storm, like how does that all play out? And the science just isn't there. And clinically, it's not appearing to be as useful as we had hoped.
Okay, well, that's, once again, thanks for the illumination. The last thing is, you had talked about like the respiratory symptoms, if for lack of a better way to put it, coming in the second week. So if you happen to come down with it, would you though start nebulizing right away instead of waiting for the second week? In other words, if you start, say, nebulizing ion or silver or the hydrogen peroxide right away when symptoms aren't respiratory in nature, would that still, in your estimation, effectively treat or at least cut down the symptoms or lessen the
Yeah, I would definitely consider doing that in the first week, especially if there's any symptom, any breathing symptoms, or if you happen to have an O2 saturation monitor. You know, if you're getting any low readings on that, totally worth starting some kind of inhaled procedure.
Okay,
And
and
then if it got at all bad, then go right to the inhaled steroids. Include that in the regimen.
in the okay, that brings up a point. In the regimen, can you do, like, if God forbid you get a couple of symptoms, even if they're mild, and you do the nebulizing of the ion, could you do that back to back with silver, or would you not back to back like literally in that same hour, but could you do it a few times? Could you do that in one night, for instance? Could you nebulize silver and then nebulize iron as well later that day, or how would that work?
Yeah,
what would you do?
I would consider that for myself, yes.
Okay, all right. So it's
Yeah.
all right to do back to back or do more than one, is what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, with all of keeping in mind, like, when just because something's natural doesn't mean it's safe or good for you or for an individual, right? And so just keeping tabs on how each treatment made someone feel, each session made myself feel. I would, you know, adjust the amounts, the quantity and or frequency and or sequence.
All right, and just to and this, I swear this is it. So if you do the silver once, and then would you do the iron maybe for you? I know how you, for you, in your opinion, if you do the silver once, and then would you do like 3 or 4 hours later, you might do the ion, and then 3 or 4 hours later do ion again, or silver again, or how would that look?
Again, if I were symptomatic or if I were trying to prevent something?
Well, actually both. First I was going to say symptomatic, but that's
Because
interesting.
so right now I'm healthy. I don't think I've had any exposure. And so it's like, what can I do to help my terrain? For me, that's nebulized. If I were looking at it, just considering nebulizing, it's ion, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I would only use the silver or hydrogen peroxide if I felt like I got exposed, because those are antivirals, but they can also kill good bacteria. And so I don't want to be, as a prevention measure, I don't want to be using silver or hydrogen peroxide, okay? I want to be using ion. A little bit of glutathione might not be, you know, that you could do as a prevention. That's not going to kill your normal microbiome, but kind of like silver, you know, if you haven't been exposed, I actually am not a big fan of silver being taken every day, whether it's nasal sprays, unless you have allergies, because silver can be anti-inflammatory as well. But hydrogen peroxide, it's like, I don't want to kill good stuff with these natural substances, versus if I went out in a big crowd, or I was concerned that somebody, you know, coughed in my face and I thought that I might have had an exposure, then as a preventative measure, I'd consider nebulizing hydrogen peroxide or silver, because they're very antiviral. And so getting a session of that nebulized, or 2 or 3 sessions of it, hey, I'm willing to kill a couple of my own microbiome bugs to kill off that virus so that I don't get an actual infection. And that goes for SARS-CoV-2 or influenza or some other nasty respiratory bug that might be going around eventually. Versus if I actually had a low oxygen saturation, that's when I'm starting to think about using inhaled steroids. Does that make sense? Does that delineate it a little bit better?
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Awesome. It's 4 o'clock now, so I feel like we're probably wrapping up, but if anybody has, maybe we'll take 1 or 2 other questions. Sylvia, yeah.
Hi, Doctor. How about children going back to school?
What about it? Nobody's going back to school in LA Unified School District.
I understand, but what do you think?
You know, most of the evidence seems like kids don't actually transmit it nearly as much as adults, which is interesting. I mean, that's one just fantastic thing about this virus is like it really seems to spare our children and young, children 18 and under, which is really neat. But more importantly, it's not just that they don't get infected. It seems like from the data I've seen, it seems like they actually don't transmit it. Somehow which I don't know, it's kind of mind bending to me because I've always thought as my kids going to school being little petri dishes, right? And they certainly have gotten me pre-COVID when they were going to school. They got myself like sick all the time with little sniffles, right? They always had one of my 3 kids always had a runny nose from school, right? Since the pandemic and they're out of school, there's no runny noses, which is fantastic. But again, the science really suggests that they don't somehow, there has been very few cases that have been tracked to the kids catching it from school, which is again fascinating to me. And for that reason, it seems like, this is a very political thing as well. My take is kids, given that data, ought to have a lot more leeway than adult groups getting back together. It might also make sense because it seems to be age discriminate. Kindergartners and under literally can go back to school, play with kindergarten and under should be just kind of pre-COVID almost. I mean, I think it would be a good idea to have some hygienic standards improved, maybe more hand washing, maybe stricter. Okay, if you do have the sniffles, keep the kid at home, right? Again, kind of more common sense, which is probably good just anyways, perhaps. But then as you move up in ages, all the way till high school or university, it probably makes sense to be extremely diligent because the older kids are better at transmitting the disease as an actual infection. So from the data I've heard about and read, it seems like a gradient would make more sense. In other words, send the littlest kids back to school almost as is, using a gradient to university where we're using a lot more safety measures. That's my take on it.
But the data comes really, I mean, the kids were protected very fast, right? We closed the schools very fast at the beginning of this. So how much data do we really have about kids in school? I'm just thinking of a camp that just closed down because of 51 kids got it, from another one, I guess. Yeah. So I'm just wondering how clear the picture is in terms of, kids getting it.
I mean, kids definitely, obviously schools, shut down a long time ago, at least in California, it was right around March 15th, kind of mid-March, basically. Yeah. But around the country, it was different, right? Some states shut schools down, some local governments shut schools down a little bit before that. And there was still, by then, I mean, there was still a lot of people infected. So, it's not that kids don't transmit the disease or the virus, but it's that it's a lot less. So, but again, it's, I mean, my opinion is that this is not something to be very afraid of, right? So it's like, don't send a kid to school and then have them go visit their sick relative in a nursing home or a sick relative outside of a nursing home who has multiple health conditions, right? Like be really diligent and really considerate. But I just, my personal opinion is much more liberal than the average opinion, including the average medical professional opinion, because I think public health has, backing up, I think public health officials have just totally effed this whole thing up. They could have been promoting healing your terrain, doing for pennies on the dollar, vitamin D, they could have been drilling in, go get your blood pressure under control, go get your blood sugar under control, even if it's with regular prescription drugs, go get those things under control. And they could have just minimized, and they could have just shut down nursing homes be pristine about it. And that alone would have decreased these deaths by, I don't know, it's a little bit theoretical, right? But it would have drastically lowered deaths and mortality and morbidity. So I think public health is just totally messed up in the potential to really get people healthy. And instead they've relied on masks, social distancing, and a vaccine that may or may not come. I think that's a really poor way to come up with a long-term infectious disease solution that is not as severe as some more infectious diseases have been, like Ebola, right? So, in the current environment, I think that a lot more emphasis ought to be put on the terrain before maybe opening schools up to kind of go a little bit deeper. If they had done that, 1 or 2 or 3 months ago, might have been a lot to ask of them 3 months ago, but they could have, once we're seeing more and more info, like within the last month or two, like now we've kind of had all summer, okay, hey, focus on getting healthy. It goes a lot more like put more emphasis on the $1 test with lower sensitivity, just so you can test this. Every kid gets up in the morning, does a $1 test. Hey, I can go to school today, or hey, I can't go to school today. Like, you minimize so much of the issue, and it's not about minimizing, it's not about eradicating this disease, or it's not about eradicating this infection. It's about keeping the population at large a lot less infected, right? And so there's some very good techniques to do that doesn't include just shutting everything down and kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. Like, that's not a long-term health solution. And that's my big issue with, again, like, I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, I think both sides are totally screwy in their overall viewpoint. Like, I'm gonna, just from a COVID-19 perspective, I'm gonna be disappointed come November, because I don't care who gets elected. Just purely from a COVID-19 standpoint, I think we're kind of screwed either way. So sorry to go on to that long rambling, but my thoughts.
Maybe we can get to somebody before then. Maybe we can get to senators and some pretty reasonable people and say, hey, why isn't this even looked at?
And, I think there's a lot more openness now in these past few months. There's a lot more openness for a lot of politicians to be a little bit more open than they might have previously been. I mean, at the end of the day, they don't, like, economies are a big deal to politicians. And when our economies are shut down like this, they're a lot more open in general, I think. So anybody here who knows anybody, I mean, I've been very active politically in trying to get information into, higher ups' hands. And so I highly encourage any and all of you to really make a push in whatever ways you see fit. I highly encourage that. I think it would be lovely.
I'll do that.
Because they are more open in general than they ever have been, I think.
Right. Okay.
They're desperate at this point. They recognize how short we are coming up with good solutions.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. I said 2 more questions, so 1 more question, and then we will be done if anyone else has one. Are we all good, or does someone else have a question?
My question, Doc, is what's the special opportunity?
What?
In the email it says stay tuned for Q&A at the end, and a special opportunity you don't want to miss.
I totally forgot about that. Thanks for asking. I don't have my special opportunity all. I forgot that was in the email, actually.
You're welcome.
Thanks. So I am going to be leading an online kind of a Reboot Your Brain series. It's going to be super cheap. But I haven't set that start date, but it's going to be in the next couple weeks. I want to give it a try. I think it would be a lot of fun. So keep your eyes and ears and emails open for that coming information. So thanks for asking. Good last question. All right. All right, everyone. Thank you for spending your time with me, and much love to you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Dr.
very
Rao.
much.
Take care.
Thanks,
everyone.
Doc.
Take care. Bye-bye.